Welcome back to Rising Waters. In today's episode, we dive into a world of nature-based solutions in both the rural and urban environment. We'll be talking about how this strategy not only helps to reduce flood risk, but also brings a host of wider benefits from improving local ecosystems to enhancing public spaces. We hope this episode will show how working with nature can make us more resilient in the face of rising water and how communities can get more involved. Let's get started. So we'll just get into introducing our guests. So Andy, if you can go first.
Hi, I'm Andy King. I'm Time Programme Manager, mostly working on Blue Green Newcastle. Really exciting project.
Very interesting project.
Yeah.
And Basil.
So I'm Basil. I work for the Environment Agency as a nature-based solutions advisor, advising local authorities on natural flood management and nature-based solutions.
Brilliant. And Krzysztof.
So Krzysztof Dabrowski. I'm a Beaver Technical Specialist. Currently sat in the national team, National Beaver team.
Excellent. And I have Zara with me today, who's going to help out with the episode.
Hi, yeah.
Introduce yourself for us.
My name's Zara Ravenscroft. I'm the Partnership and Engagement team leader, but also an undercover marine biologist.
Excellent. So it seems like we have the right people to talk about today. So let's just jump straight into it. What is natural flood management? Big question.
So it's become a bit of a kind of a catch-all term for what would essentially be working with natural processes to address flood risk. Traditional flood risk management has all been about engineered solutions, concrete, building weirs, building floodgates. But the modifications of the natural environment has meant that it doesn't behave, rivers don't behave and floodplains don't behave in the way that they should. So natural flood management is working with those processes to try and restore the functions and reduce flood risk for people and properties.
Excellent.
Can you give some examples so we can sort of visualise natural flood management, or perhaps what's missing at the moment and how you're bringing this back?
Yeah, so I think
I'd say what's missing is it's looking back into history of what our historic landscape used to be like. We look at rivers as a sort of channel that wiggles through the landscape, but that is because of the way we have modified the land around them or modified the rivers themselves. You know, historically, rivers and wetlands were all connected, and they stored water went slowly through them, and as humans modified the landscape, they tried to get that water down and out as quick as possible. So trying to revert back to that historic landscape is not only better for natural flood management, it's more biodiverse as well, and climate resilient, and has a lot more benefits to it.
Naturally based solutions and things like that, they don't always look like how people expect. We've kind of been, I don't want to say brainwashed, but almost in front of us we have the most visual aspects of this, and sometimes there's a lot of it that goes unseen. And I know we had a conversation previously about what that looks like. Could you give us a bit more information about that?
Yeah, so I think when you say natural flood management to people, the first thing that kind of springs to mind is leaky dams.
Yeah.
Often these they are wooden structures, but they're almost engineered within the channels designed to hold water back. And people are aware of things like tree planting and attenuation features, sort of ponds to hold back water. But it actually covers a much greater range of functions than that. So, when we talk about it, so river restoration and floodplain reconnection sort of helps manage flood risk, helps the water flow out instead of out into properties and into towns. Coastal restoration, so coastal realignment, allows the tidal water to move in and out more naturally rather than coming up against hard defences. And then, when you really get into it, a lot of how land is managed comes into this. So soil health, for instance, soil becomes compacted and degraded over years of either being worked for agriculture or being, walked on and driven on. And what that means is that water can't infiltrate into the soil anymore. So it runs off. So by improving soil health and soil aeration, we can slow that water down and allow it to get into the groundwater.
When you say soil aeration, it's they're basically the air pockets in the soil, and it's the organics and that which have air pockets and so on. And when it rains, those basically fill up with water and act like a bit of a sponge, and then will slowly release that water. So not only does it reduce flood peaks, if you've got healthy soils, it'll reduce the chances of drought when there's not much rain as well. So I think, following on from what you say of what do people, used to looking at or think about when they think natural flood management, but I guess doing a lot of work in the headwaters, in the uplands, and in the peat areas, the moorlands, they can act like a huge sponge. So over time they've been degraded for
Well, since this sort of industrial revolution,
Yeah.
it's like,
Yeah.
Well, it's land
result.
management is the choice. So like, there's a lot of historic land management, draining of peat moorland, and for a lot of it's for shooting. And unfortunately, that degrades the soil. It releases carbon from drying up peat, and it reduces its ability to act like a giant sponge. So as you restore those, if you fill in those ditches and so on, you plant sphagnum mosses, you hold the water back there. When, as we all know, it rains often a lot in the hills or in the highlands. It rains there a lot. So if we can restore those, we can get a bigger sponge essentially, which also traps carbon and is better for biodiversity.
So it's like holding it back at the source, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And then
Allowing it to
slowly
go down and then
releasing
catching it there.
Yeah.
It's a case of like we can probably stop it from getting to that point anyway.
Yeah. So traditionally we've tried to address flood risks at the point that it floods.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But by that point, it's almost too late.
Yeah.
You know, you're fighting against nature then. Whereas if you can work with nature further up and try and reduce the risk of that ever happening in the first place, it's a much more sustainable way of managing it.
So if we're bringing in sort of nature and we're talking about natural flood management, we're talking about the habitats. And Krzysztof, you mentioned biodiversity.
Mm-hmm.
How important is it for us to kind of think about the sort of whole system and the habitats, but also the species? I'm thinking you introduced yourself as a Beaver Technical Specialist. So thinking about those eco-engineers and those species that can help us alongside natural flood management.
Well, a lot of it's about balance. There is an imbalance in the system now, whether it's, the climate or our rivers or whatever, and that's why they're under pressure. That's why you have extreme weather, because there's an imbalance. If you can restore that balance through restoring nature by reintroducing species, formerly native species that have evolved for our landscape and evolved along other species, you can sort of bring that balance back. And when you bring that balance back, you have more habitats, you have more stable climates that can support more species, and it just flourishes from there. And that has lots of benefits to society. There's a lot of studies out there that will say an increased biodiversity is better for the economy, better for people, better for health, better for land, water, air, soil health. A lot of these things play their part. So beavers are just one of many keystone species that can play a really important part in our nature recovery. Do you want me to talk about beavers? I can go off on a tangent if I do.
Well, for listeners, maybe you could just give us a little bit of a history about beavers. So the work that's going on in the country and reintroduction of beavers. There's a bit of misinformation out there, I think. So if you could give a summary about what is a beaver?
So a beaver is the second largest rodent in the world after the capybara. So we have the Eurasian beaver here. There's two species of beaver. There's the Eurasian beaver and there's the North American beaver. And they are genetically distinct, even though they look very similar and occupy similar niches in the environment, have similar behaviours. They are different to the point at which they couldn't breed. They're genetically that different. So beavers were extinct around 400 years ago. It really depends. There's not definite sort of records in all places. Northumberland, I think, is about 600 years, they reckon.
Wow.
So it's been quite a long time since they were here, and they were wiped out because of predominantly for like hunting, for their meat, their fur, their castoreum, all sorts really. Their tails, like they eat and consumed and used all sorts of parts of them, and we lost a really important keystone species from our rivers, from our wetlands, and then alongside us modifying rivers as well. It's why our rivers have changed so much. What was the question again?
just tell us about
Yeah.
beavers.
Oh, right, okay, yeah. So what are we doing, and why do people want to reintroduce them? People have basically realised that how much they can do for busy as a beaver comes. That sort of phrase comes for a reason, because if you watch them or you observe their bit, what they get up to, they work very hard, and they don't do it for us. They do it for themselves out of pure instinct. They want to create safe environments for themselves, for their family, for their, to access food. Everything they do, is for sort of them and their preservation and to reproduce. But that provides a lot of benefits in our environment. And it's these sort of large interventions that people want or need, or desire, because we need radical change because our rivers and our wetlands, we don't have many wetlands left. Our rivers are in a very poor state, and if they're one tool of many, I guess, that could be used to help us restore. And so beavers, they dam rivers, they create wetlands. Basically, that's to access food and have somewhere safe to live and to reproduce. They don't dam just for the sake of it. If a river's deep enough, they won't dam. So people think, anywhere you get beavers, you'll get lots of damming, but not necessarily. They are actually very good burrowers. So they burrow into earth banks generally, sort of similar like what badgers do, but by the river. Yeah, that's their homes that they create, basically.
I've just got one more beaver question before we move on. It's not just a beaver episode. Yeah. Could you see beavers in the wild in this country? Is it possible?
So yes, there are beavers in the wild now. Yes, they're mostly in the sort of south of England and in the west and in the Midlands, West Midlands, I think. My geography is not great.
So if we
and essentially those. Well, there are beavers in enclosures as well. So there's beavers in the wild and there's beavers in enclosure. And there is one licensed population down on the River Otter. All the other beavers that are across the south of England are generally escapes or have been illegally reintroduced. But yes, there is quite a population and growing. So for the Environment Agency, our role is to see how we can maximise benefits and minimise risk. So like I said before, they do burrow, so we'd need to sort of check that they're not burrowing in our flood embankments. So a lot of what the work that we're doing is how we detect them and then what we do, and making sure we have all the measures in place to legally manage them if we need to.
So if we're bringing it back to the context of flooding, their part in sort of the feedback loop, sort of if we think about so those keystone species and things like that, where do they sit within that flooding context?
Yeah, well, because they dam and they do, and especially in smaller rivers, which I guess potentially maybe more away from risk, away from urban areas. If they're up in the headwaters or up from towns and villages, their dams will attenuate flows, and they create habitats that are great for fish and all sorts, and birds that kingfishers eating the fish in the ponds and pools and that kind of stuff. So biodiversity increases around these areas. But yeah, they can really slow the flow. So there's a study from Plymouth undertaken by the University of Exeter, and they found that they basically tested NFM measures alongside beavers, and these are enclosed beavers, so they kind of have to sort of stay where they're put. And after 4.5 years of the hydraulic monitoring, they found there was a 23% reduction in the peak flows. So that could be the difference between areas downstream flooding and not. And that was sort of a combination of NFM measures, as leaky barriers and all that kind of stuff, and the beavers, and I think the combination of the two showed to be really, really effective.
I've got a beautiful image painted now, and hopefully many other people listening will have, of these kind of wild areas looking to rewild more and introduce keystone species or valuing nature. However, we live in quite an urbanised area, so I was just going to bring Andy in, and if we're thinking about from a source to sea catchment, Newcastle is an absolute perfect example to describe this. So Andy, if you could just describe how in an urban context we could still use nature to control flood risk, specifically talking about Newcastle city centre.
Much the same reasons that Krzysztof and Basil have said. If you can use nature to capture water at source, say if that's a green roof, and use that to slow the flow down, it's exactly the same kind of processes. If you think about our city centre, perhaps Newcastle is quite bereft of biodiversity at the moment, right in the very core of the city. If we can bring nature back into the city centre to capture and slow down flow, but also bring in biodiversity and perhaps introduce foraging for pollinators, it's providing a lot of different kind of services, if you like.
Do you want to elaborate on that? Because we've touched on it ever so slightly, But in terms of bringing nature, habitat, whether it's engineered by beavers or by civil engineers like Andy, what other wider benefits can they bring?
Well, we're quite excited by Blue Green Newcastle because we're looking at like a whole sort of provision of services across the city. So you think, oh, it's nature-based solutions, but we're talking about how it influences transport plan, how it influences public health, active travel, a whole raft of important city services that are required. For as kind of an out there, we've got the Royal Victoria Infirmary, who the summer before we had quite a bit of a heat wave in Newcastle. They had quite a large introduction of people with heat stroke, surprisingly. But it's a well-known fact that introducing nature-based solutions into urban environment helps with urban cooling.
Yeah.
So having trees, like it's shown that green cities react much better to sort of climate, well, like heat waves and that kind of stuff, don't they? And I think help cut air pollution and that kind of stuff, and probably absorb an intake of the when it rains, so
the value just once you start digging into what it provides people who live in the city, that clean air is quite a big input. So Newcastle have tried a legislative approach to clean air about introducing sort of tax effectively on diesel vehicles and commercial vehicles, but you could also work with it by, exactly as Krzysztof said, by introducing more planting, soak up the nitrous oxides, ozone, into the organic matter of the plants.
So you mentioned green roofs. What else? What else is out there? I know there's a term SUDS that gets bandied around quite a lot, but if you could explain what that means.
SUDS is it's a very engineered solution, but uses soil and plants to really make it work well and better, if you like. So you're specifically choosing locations to put SUDS to get maximum hydraulic benefit. So what it does is it captures your first kind of runoff into a tank effectively that's filled with soil that can slowly drain away, but then excess flows can go into a series of things like bioswales and be stored on the surface.
That's interesting.
Really maximise use of like evapotranspiration from plants to get rid of that water.
It's interesting with Newcastle because it is extremely urban, and you're almost shocked to see water in Newcastle, even though there's 3 rivers running underneath it. And that's it just shows you how much we've come away from our natural environment in that space. And obviously it's a city, that's what we do, but it's interesting because this project's looking to reconnect people with the water around them, and maybe that will bring a bit more awareness about the flooding that happens, because obviously predominantly Newcastle's risk is surface, but then you've got the fluvial element underneath.
Yes, that loss of those waterways and deans and valleys that used to run through the city. I think it was from somewhere like 1400 onwards, those historic burns. I think it's actually 5 or 6 that went through the city centre.
Yeah.
Clues are in the names in the streets, like Dean Street and High Bridge Street, which is a bridge over the watercourse. It's quite obvious, I guess, in a way, when you look at it, that the loss of those watercourses and valleys, you're obviously going to end up with a surface water impact where those watercourses were.
Yeah, because that's where the water naturally flows, and it's not exactly like we can put some beavers underneath the city to help us with that.
Well, we put a shopping mall in the way.
Just
But water can't soak into the ground if it's in a concrete basically channel, and it can't evaporate if it's got a concrete roof over the top. And it can't be used by people to walk along and get
enjoy
some nature and enjoy if it's just underground and no one knows it's there. So I was thinking of there was one town in the northeast in particular where they built the high street facing, it was away from the river, rather than, because the river used to be so polluted and it used to be seen as like, we don't go there, don't want to go anywhere near. And I guess times are changing now, because I think they're redeveloping that to utilise that area near the river.
Oh, that's good.
Health and well-being is such a big issue. There's an academic study that I read where they monitored people who'd been to a dentist and monitored their pain levels. So they did a control who just went home and sat on the sofa. Some people went to the sea, looked out at sort of that blue landscape, and others went into nature and they monitored. And there was a dramatic increase in the pain felt if you were in nature or if you were looking at the sea. And it's phenomenal because that was without any pain medication whatsoever. Being in nature meant that you felt less pain, which is phenomenal. And I feel like, why wouldn't you want to restore it and squeeze it into every single space you can? And I guess, Basil, we touched on green roofs, Andy mentioned, and we touched on suds. But what else in terms of natural flood management? How much have we lost, and how else can we think more boldly, I guess, and at scale?
Well, we're, as a country, we have become completely disconnected from the natural environment. You know, people think they aren't, but actually what we see as the natural environment now is not real. You know, as far as it's not actually wild or natural. There was a study done in 2019 by, I think it's McGill University in Montreal, that showed that 97% of the rivers in the UK have been modified by people. And therefore, you know, like Krzysztof said earlier, what we see is not how they actually perform. And they've been modified for, you know, in way before the Industrial Revolution. Our landscape has been modified and changed. So we have no living memory of what it really should look like and how it should function. And that has, you know, people have busy lives, and, you know, we've moved away from being connected with it. And we went through a period where, as Krzysztof said, you know, rivers were seen as, they were a sewer, essentially. They weren't something to be, you know, sort of enjoyed or spent your leisure time around. But we've kind of passed that, and it's getting better. But then we need to figure out how we reconnect people with that. And when we approach flood risk, we do it in exactly the same way. We've siloed these things into, this is flood defence, this is, you know, nature conservation or habitat restoration. Yeah, and actually these things are combined and they're intrinsically linked. And by trying to separate them, it won't work. We just go around in circles trying to do the same thing. And so, yeah, getting people to kind of understand that, you know, the benefits and the results of, say, a floodplain reconnection. You know, people might see that it looks like we're just, you know, just flooding farmland. But actually, not only is it allowing a river to move around and put water out, but it's improving air quality, soil quality, biodiversity, it's carbon sequestration, it's all that sort of stuff. And it's having those conversations, I think, and being open to, we're always at a risk of being in an echo chamber. I think a lot of us who work in the kind of ecological world, we're surrounded by people who also work in that field. And it's quite easy for us to just think, well, this is straightforward. And actually, everybody must think the same as me. And it's really important that we don't get caught in that, and we talk to people about their concerns and understand why they would be worried about these measures. And the other, I mean, for me, the big thing about natural flood management is that it's, if you build a concrete wall, the concrete wall is there. It's there then, and it's very hard to do anything with it after that. But if you work in the uplands and you put in some leaky dams, if they're not quite working the way that you want them to work, you can take them out and you can move them and you can change the process and you can continually assess it. So it's this constantly evolving thing. And again, with concrete, you know, I think we get caught up in this thing of that it's one or the other. That it's natural flood management or it's engineering.
And they can work together.
And actually, the most effective ways we put ecosystem services, things like beavers, things like that. Human intervention as natural flood management and restoration, and engineered solutions where it needs to be engineered. But the best way that we can do them, in the most nature-friendly way we can do them, and you combine all of those things, and then you get the best results.
And you were talking about silos, and it's sometimes you can even see it that we have a team for nature-based solutions, we have a team for harder management, and with that, I know that I can see it within the office that you guys are talking to each other constantly. But sometimes it doesn't always match up because there might be something that was put in a very long time ago, and now you think, oh, actually this nature-based solution would work really well if we just didn't have that there, or, you know, just these different aspects to it. And it's a difficult concept overall because you're always retro-engineering almost and kind of trying to undo this, the sins of our past, really. And that must be quite difficult.
So I mean, surprisingly, I'm not from the northeast. And but I spent a lot of time working in the southeast, and a lot of our rivers are very different, but almost all of them have big, high earth embankments running down the entire length of them. And what you can see when these floodplains are underwater around them is the water's not coming from the river. Those embankments haven't burst. The water's come from the floodplain, from externally, but it's then trapped in the floodplain by these embankments. And because the river's not allowed to function and the floodplain's not allowed to function, we've caused a whole load of other problems. But because people for years and years and for longer than any of us have been alive have been told these embankments protect you from flooding. It's very hard to then have that conversation to say, actually, we need to be changing how we think about these things and how we understand them.
We need to look at our rivers. They should typically be more dynamic. Everyone thinks, if something changes in a river, there's an erosion and the river moves a couple of meters this way, or it's burst its banks. Those banks are artificial. That's something someone's put in there. But the river wants to move. The reason why it floods, and it wants to, it wants to re-meander itself. It doesn't want to be straight. It's fighting. It's fighting the things that we've put in place. If you left it for long enough, it would. And things like having trees along rivers and the wood that goes in, it's really, really important for our rivers. The woods, they call it the riparian strip, or the riparian woodland, or the riparian part of the river is the trees and shrubs and scrub and everything that goes along the side, and that provides shading, and it provides habitat for multiple species, but it also introduces wood into rivers. And I think a lot of times we think, that tree shouldn't be in a river. That tree is falling in and it's causing the river to go this way instead of that way. But that's natural. That's how it should be. And that's, having a tree in a river is just the start of it trying to restore itself. So it's giving it more sort of roughness. It's giving it more diversity of flow. And rather than it all just being the same, everything moves the same speed and so on, then you don't have many habitats in there for fish and other species. But put wood in rivers and it can slow the water down. It can trap other things. It can send the flow this way, that way. It can introduce food for other species, that's in the river. So I think that's something maybe we have to challenge is, thinking that wooden trees shouldn't be in river, because that they absolutely should be, and that's one of the best sort of natural flood managements potentially, because a leaky dam essentially is a tree that's fallen in a river and trapped other bits of wood and then become a dam. So we're just replicating that.
And I think where a great example of this in our area as well is if you go down to Teesside and you look down there. So industrial Teesside, it's a real contradiction in some ways, because you have highly industrial area, and then you have some of the most amazing natural habitats, and these are coastal habitats. And down on Teesside, we've been building flood walls since the 1800s. And what we've actually started doing is basically putting holes in those walls and allowing the sea to come in and leaving it to do to restore a natural process. And I know myself and Basil, we've been lucky enough to go down there and monitor it and see exactly how that habitat is naturally restoring itself with very little human intervention. And we had a really exciting day, and I don't know, Basil likes fish, and I think it's worth mentioning. So coastal habitats, when you let the sea come in, you'll get a process where salt marsh is a type of habitat will start to naturally restore, and salt marsh provides so many wider benefits to society in terms of carbon sequestration, water quality improvements. I already mentioned the health and well-being benefits of being by the sea. But also in terms of fish species, we had some quite exciting discovery. I don't know if you want to mention that.
Well, yeah. It's always incredible how quickly fish and other species come back to these environments. It happens so rapidly. But again, these things like salt marsh and intertidal habitats have declined so much that we don't really understand how the natural world interacts with them that much anymore. And so the restoration of these is a really good way to learn. And when we were doing the fish surveys, we found shoals of juvenile mackerel. I can't remember how many, was it 11 kilometres from the sea? And this is not documented, as far as we can tell, anywhere else in the country. These, mackerel are a deeper water species. They do move up and down the coast in these big shoals, but we have no other evidence of them using salt marshes. And we monitored them over a tide cycle. They weren't trapped. They were perfectly happy where they were, moving around in this salt marsh. But what it shows is that, this is something it's never been considered that this habitat might be important for them. But now, we're starting to understand that there's loads of stuff we don't know.
Yeah. And by restoring this habitat, we're also helping the general health of our oceans, because those mackerel will go back out, reproduce, and again support sustainable fishing industry, or there's lots of economic benefits that also we're looking through a natural capital approach of valuing.
I think we're very much in that discovery phase. It is quite exciting.
Yeah.
We are learning what happens when you let the sea back in, what happens when you reintroduce species, what happens when you stop farming the land, all this sort of stuff, when you restore peat, all these things, there's still so much we can learn and are learning, and we'll get some things wrong along the way. It won't be perfect, but as long as we learn and share that learning and keep trying, we've got hope, I guess.
I think
I'm hopeful.
I've definitely got hope now. Now that we've had this conversation, I think what's interesting as well is like we touched on it earlier, just where trying to involve stakeholders and basically people who are living in these areas and sort of businesses and things like that. We're changing the environment around them, and if we don't consult and don't speak with them first, we often find that it becomes a bit of an issue, in the sense that it could be good for the environment, but we've then caused a social issue. And so how can we help communities, businesses get involved with things like blue green and sort of the nature-based solutions? What can they look for? Where do they go to find out this is happening in their area?
It's quite a big message to get out, I guess. As partners in Blue Green Newcastle, we're developing a strategy to kind of share the information and to get community involved. And it almost starts kind of at property level, and just having people get excited about their own space and what it can do for them, even if it's down to planting high value crops like herbs in the backyard, but sort of sharing that's financial benefit and health benefit, but it's also capturing rainwater at source again. It's all part of the process, and that sort of builds kind of pride in the whole, pride and education, I guess, in the whole process. So it's about ownership.
So
not everyone has a garden, do they, or a yard, but I guess everyone can, maybe people can go and speak to their local councils and say, look, there's this green space, you just mow it all the time. Why can we not have wildflowers on there? Because I think most people, when a wildflower grassland is in bloom, most people I think would agree it looks brilliant, and you have the bees and the pollinators and so on, and then it improves the soil quality, and that improves its the infiltration for the water and so on. So there are options, even if you can't do anything directly yourself, you can influence the things around you.
It is on all of us though to be having these conversations and to be talking to people. And I know within the Environment Agency we have people that go out, and there are lots of great charities, in the northeast. There's lots of great, Wildlife Trust, Rivers Trust, Natural History Society, all these people we're all going in the same direction. We all want the same thing. But it has been an issue within the conservation world, and we have in the past had a habit of going to communities and telling them what's best for them, and that it doesn't work. It never works. They have to have the buy-in, and the best thing we can do is have these things as community-led, but with help and support and advice from people who can provide them that technical expertise. And I think Blue Green City is a prime example of it, that the more deprived neighbourhoods are much less likely to have flourishing green space, but there's things that can be done, and these people have to feel included and they have to be part of it.
So if we had a listener here who was thinking, I actually really love AstroTurf, I'm going to AstroTurf my garden, or, it's getting wetter, the climate's changing, and I think block paving is a way forward, because then, my car isn't going to get muddy. I know these may be two controversial statements to this particular panel audience, but what would your advice be, and how can people get enthused and realise there is an alternative? What would your suggestions be? Anyone?
It's not an either or. That's the thing, is that we're not saying dig up your entire driveway and plant grass on it and whatever happens to your car. But there's better ways of doing it. So permeable surfaces, permeable driveway surfaces, it still provides the same function, but you don't have the runoff issue. And the thing with AstroTurf is that it's not just the impact of the water running off it. It suffocates the soil beneath it, and it breaks down, releases microplastics into the soil. It's a long-term effect for something that's relatively short-term gain. The other thing is with runoff is that you might not see it as an issue with your driveway, your 10 square metre driveway, but if everyone else on your street does the same thing, your whole street then has no surface to absorb that water. And it may not flood your house, but the likelihood is it's going to start contributing to the flooding of your neighbours or overwhelming your drains. People worry about combined sewage overflows. The drains are being overwhelmed because there's no surface to absorb it.
What is a combined sewer overflow? Just for anybody listening.
It's so in lots of places in the UK we have combined sewers. So surface water and rainwater flows into the same network as your sewage does, your foul water sewer. And what happens in high rainfall events is that system becomes overwhelmed, and at that point sewage can then be discharged out directly into rivers and waterways, because the sewage systems that we have can't cope with that amount of water.
And the alternative is?
The alternative is that we either separate these systems, which some places have, or we create environments that hold that water and store that water and infiltrate it into the soil rather than sending it straight into the drains.
So it's back to that message that your what may feel like small actions can actually have a huge impact. And by keeping the water stored where it falls, then you are potentially having a huge impact to our water quality, our biodiversity and our climate as well.
I think maybe there could be, an argument for try and strike a bit more of a balance. My neighbour, maybe as an example, he's got a kid football mad, constantly outside playing football, and they have AstroTurf, but for them it's brilliant because the kid can play all year long. But maybe the balance is, rather than having it drain into the drains, you have an area where it can drain into a little pond or a little soakaway area, so that the water doesn't go into the drains and then into the sewer system and so on and contribute to flood. Maybe it goes into this pond and then it soaks away into the ground, and then that can help. So it's all like a driveway. Do you need enough space for 3 cars, or could you get 2 cars and a little soakaway area or something? And you can plan that up with like native species. You could have it's just a little basin and have wildflowers coming out of it. It's more about a lot about getting a balance rather than
multifunctionality, isn't it? It's a key to the solution, isn't it? As Basil's mentioned earlier, we've been very siloed in how we've thought in the past and not appreciated how doing one thing can have a benefit in another area. Krzysztof's example is really good. It's you've got a functional sort of space for recreation, but it doesn't necessarily have to cause a surface water flooding issue, and you can build in biodiversity around it.
We found that blue-green was basically, with the original conception was flooding, surface water flooding, but where it ended up being was everything else was on top of that, and it just so happens to help with flooding. And I think that's the way we need to approach some of these things now.
Absolutely. Yeah, it needs to be whichever way we approach and however we fund. Funding is always a problem, so we have to find funding from different sources, but we need to be looking at projects that we do as all of the benefits, not just focusing on a single thing.
Totally agree.
You mentioned planting native species. Biodiversity, should we, if you were planting your garden at home, focus purely on native species, or as ecologists, is it more about just getting nature in and getting species in that will attract pollinators, attract wildlife?
I think a little bit of research can go a long way, because so many of the invasive non-native species out there started in garden centres and so on, and they didn't know potentially they were invasive. And sometimes certain plants now are still sold at garden centres that can become invasive. There's an argument, I would say, in a changing climate that there is potential for planting of certain, say like a tree species typically found in the north of France. Now, a climate change, it means that the south of England suddenly becomes the same climate as what it was in the north of France 20 years ago. But the species that we have in these areas, are struggling because it's too hot for them, and because climate change is happening so fast, that species can't naturally, that tree species, which might live hundreds of years, it can't move north quick enough. So it dies because it's basically succumbed to drought and it's too hot and too dry. So I think, choosing species wisely and following guidance that's out there.
I think, it is very easy to say only native. you know, but it's all relevant, isn't it? It's all in the context of where you're doing it. If you were talking about planting trees in the Cheviots, you're not going to want people to plant non-native ornamental trees. It won't work. But if you're talking about gardens and cities, then we have to strike a balance between the biodiversity and the aesthetic side of things. You know, if you want people to enjoy the environment, then people, like, the aesthetics is a big part of it, isn't it? And so therefore, if you walk around Newcastle, there are lots of areas with tree planting where they're not necessarily native trees, but they all have a really valuable function of being there.
Beech trees, I think, went native to the north of England, were they? Now they're everywhere. I think I know, because I was looking at hedges recently, and
start looking at some hedges.
To plant one, and there's often people put in a species called cherry laurel. Now, cherry laurel isn't invasive. The seeds get eaten by birds, get spread, gets in the environment. So it can take over, a bit like you see with rhododendron, it can really take over. But there's another species called Portuguese laurel. So Portuguese, probably not native here, but it has a lot more benefits, and it isn't seen to be invasive. I'm not necessarily saying that's the best option, but they're both laurel species, but slightly different ones, and one could, one is far better for our native biodiversity than another one, which is technically invasive. But both you can buy, no problem.
So educating yourself is really key then.
Just
looking things up, doing a bit of research, ringing Krzysztof for some advice.
So I think you had a question for our guests, didn't you? A very final one.
Yeah. So 2019 saw most of our local authorities declare a climate emergency and set goals to be carbon neutral by 2030. Really ambitious. In that time, some might say we haven't seen the radical change that we really need. If you were waking up tomorrow and stepping outside, opening your door, what kind of world would you like to be stepping into? Would you ideally like to see?
I'd like to see one that's really better connected with nature and better planted out. I feel, for me, I know it's not necessarily a net zero thing, but just being able to have spaces where you can just stop and reflect and take time out in a nice, calm area.
That would be nice.
That's one for me, but there you go.
Basil?
Yeah, I mean, it's on a very similar theme. I think a better use of our green spaces and more open conversations about the connectivity with nature, more work to ensure that people are connected with what surrounds them. I mean, the Northeast, there's recent stats for children in the Northeast are some of the least nature connected in the country. We live in one of the least populated parts of the country, So for people to be engaged with and understand nature and appreciate what's going on around them and have the opportunity to do that.
That'd be great.
I'd like to see free and wild rivers. I think if we gave space for water, space for nature all around rivers, then so many things would thrive from that. And again, there's this argument of, well, we need to feed ourselves, we need our lands, crops and so on to feed ourselves. But actually, sometimes those crops don't feed us. They feed animals for cheap meat, or they go into producing non-essential food items, drinks, alcohol, that kind of stuff. Do you need to sort of harm nature and farm right next to a river just to produce some cheap alcohol, for example? So I think, having more space for nature, where we can farm in balance with nature, and would be a great start.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, everyone. That was really insightful. Really appreciate that. And thank you, Zara, for helping me out with this episode.
And there's so many fantastic projects going on in the Northeast, and lots of them are always looking for volunteers. So we can share links with listeners to some fantastic projects from coastal right through to our uplands, where you can get involved and you can get out and it's free and you can feel like you're contributing and also learning about all the fantastic wildlife we have in the Northeast.
Cool. Thank you very much. Thank you for watching this episode of Rising Waters. Next, we'll share some quick tips on how to protect your property from flooding. While it's impossible to eliminate the risk of flooding for your home or business, there are many cost-effective measures you can take to minimize the damage. First, assess your property for vulnerabilities. For instance, if you have air bricks, consider installing covers to prevent the water from entering your home during a flood. You might also want to install non-return valves on drains and pipes. These can help prevent sewage from backing up through the toilets and the sinks during flooding. If your property is at risk of flooding, keep sandbags or self-inflating flood bags on hand to ensure you're fully prepared. For more tips on property flood resilience and a list of reputable companies, visit bluepages.org.uk. This directory provides valuable information on various products and services designed to help reduce your flood risk. Thanks again for watching Rising Waters. Remember to stay dry, stay alert, and stay safe. This episode of Rising Waters is made possible by all of our partners and volunteers. Make sure to check out the show notes or description for this episode to learn more about what you heard today.